The sun was sinking low over the wide plains. The sky was turning a soft, warm orange. Irma knelt outside her small wooden farmhouse. She was scrubbing an old pair of trousers in a heavy wooden bucket. The trousers had belonged to her husband, who had died many years ago. The regular splash of the water and the hard rub of the cloth were the only things that kept her mind quiet. For a long time, her life had been nothing but this quiet routine. She worked from sunrise to sunset, alone on the edge of the world. Then something on the far horizon made her stop. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and looked out toward the west. A dark shape was moving against the bright sky. It was a horse, but it was not moving the way a healthy horse should. Even from far away, Irma could see something was wrong. The animal moved too slowly. It stumbled with every single step. Its head hung very low, almost touching the dry grass. It was moving on nothing but pure willpower. Irma rose to her feet slowly. She wrung the cold water from her hands, her large green fingers pressing tight against each other. People rarely came out this far. When riders did show up on her land, it was seldom good news. Most humans stayed far away from her fence line. She watched the horse stagger closer and closer. The poor animal was covered in sweat and dust. Finally, just as it reached the edge of her yard, its legs gave out. The horse collapsed into the dirt, folding beneath its own weight. The rider fell with it, tumbling limp onto the ground. Irma did not hesitate. She ran across the yard, her boots kicking up dust. When she reached the fallen rider, she knelt down and turned him over onto his back. He was a human man. His lips were cracked and bleeding from the heat. His skin was scorched by the harsh sun. There were old, faded scars on his face, but there were also new wounds that were still fresh. His breathing was very shallow. It was so weak that she could barely feel it. She shook his shoulder hard, trying to get him to open his eyes, and that was when she heard it. It was a thin, fragile cry. It was so Before I continue, I'd like to make a quick announcement. I'm sharing some really steamy and completely uncensored orc stories on my Patreon page. Stories I can't post on YouTube. You can find the details in the description. Just a heads up, the content there is really steamy. Small, it sounded like a bird rising from somewhere against the man's chest. Irma's hands moved fast. She pulled back his heavy, dust-covered coat. Beneath the thick leather, she found a thick rope. It was bound tightly around his body, holding something secure against his torso. With trembling fingers, she worked the rough knot loose. She pulled back the folds of an old, worn wool shawl. Inside the shawl were two babies. They were twins. Their faces were red and flushed with sweat. They were crying weakly, their tiny fists moving in the air. They could not have been more than a few months old. For one long second, Irma simply stood there on her knees. The wind blew softly across the yard. A dying man lay at her feet. A dying horse lay beside him. And now, two tiny infants were resting in her large arms. She could feel the faint, rapid beating of their little hearts. There was no time to think or wonder. She lifted the babies gently, holding them close to her chest. She carried them inside her house first. The rooms were dark and cool. She laid the small bundle down carefully on a soft blanket near the warm hearth. Then she turned around and went right back out into the yard for the man. He was heavy, built with broad shoulders, and she had to use all of her strength to move him. Dragging him across the dry dirt yard took everything she had. Her breath came in hard pants, but she did not stop until she had him inside. She left him on the wooden floor of her front room. His chest rose and fell in ragged, painful pulls. "Stay alive," she muttered down at him, her voice deep and rough. "I did not drag you all this way just to watch you die on my floor." The infants began to wail louder now. The sound filled the empty house. Their hunger was clear. Irma moved quickly to her small kitchen. She warmed some fresh milk over the fire. She added a little warm water to thin it out carefully, making sure it would not be too heavy for their tiny stomachs. She sat down on the floor by the hearth and took one baby at a time. She held the first little girl and fed her, murmuring low, soft words. They were old words of comfort, words she did not even remember learning. Slowly, the first baby's cries softened into small, hiccuping sighs. Then, Irma took the second baby and did the same. Soon, both children were quiet, their small bellies full. Only then did she turn her attention back to the stranger. She knelt beside him and began to check his pockets for anything that could tell her who he was. In his coat pocket, her fingers found a piece of crumpled paper. She opened it and saw a name scrawled across the page in dark ink. Adam Carter. Irma got a bowl of clean water and a clean cloth. She began to clean his wounds. The worst one was a deep, ugly gash along his left shoulder. The edges of the cut were already turning an angry, bright red. It was hot to the touch, showing the first signs of a fever. His hands were raw and covered in deep blisters. It looked as if he had gripped the leather reins for hours and hours without a single moment of rest. Looking at those hands, Irma understood what kind of night this man had survived. A man did not ride like that unless he was running from something terrible, or unless he was riding toward something worth dying for. It was well past midnight when the man finally stirred. The fire had burned down to low, glowing red coals. The room was dark and filled with long shadows. Adam's first movement was frantic. His eyes flew open, wild with fear. His arms reached out blindly, searching for the bundle that was no longer tied to his chest. His breath came in sharp, terrified gasps. "They are alive," Irma said quickly. She spoke in a calm, steady voice before the panic could completely take hold of him. "Both of them are safe." Adam turned his head slowly, his neck stiff with pain. He looked across the small room. In a low wicker basket right beside the hearth, the two twins were sleeping soundly under a warm blanket. The heavy tension in his face seemed to dissolve all at once. His shoulders dropped against the floor. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the wood and the soft breathing of the babies. "You live out here all alone?" he finally asked. His voice was hoarse and scraped dry like sand. Irma gave a short nod. She did not look away from him. He looked at her green skin, her strong jaw, and the heavy lines of her face. He told her, in a low whisper, that he had once heard a rumor about a farm out in this direction, a rumor about an orc widow who was known for taking in travelers in need. When the trouble started, it was the only direction he had left to run. Irma felt something tighten deep inside her chest. It had been 50 years since the great treaty between their peoples was signed. Yet even after all this time, most humans still would not come within a mile of her wooden fence line. They looked at her with old fear and hatred in their eyes. But this man had ridden through the dark night on nothing but a faint rumor. He had trusted that an orc would save his life, and more importantly, the lives of two small human children who were not even his own. Outside, the night wind moved through the tall grass. The farmhouse, which had been silent for so many years, held its breath around the sound of two small hearts still beating. By the next morning, the sun was bright, and Adam was strong enough to sit up and speak in full sentences. However, his voice stayed very low. It was worn thin by deep grief and physical exhaustion. Irma sat across from him at the wooden table. She placed a hot bowl of meat broth between them and waited for him to tell his story. 4 days ago, he told her, he had been traveling near the river crossing. He had come across the terrible wreckage of a caravan. The large wooden wagons were overturned and smashed to pieces. Smoke was still rising from the wood. Everyone he found was already dead. He had arrived too late to save anyone, or so he believed at first. He began to check the broken wagons for any signs of life. While checking the last wagon, he found a woman collapsed across the floorboards. She was already gone, her skin cold. but her body was positioned in a strange way. She was curved tightly, as though she had been shielding something precious beneath her until her very last breath. When he moved her body gently, he found a hidden compartment cut deep into the wooden floor of the wagon. Inside that dark hole were the two babies. Their mother had hidden them there from the attackers. Then she had laid herself over the opening, using her own body as a living shield. Irma said nothing. She kept her hand steady on her own cup. She had seen great loss before in her life. She had buried her own husband in the earth behind the barn. She had watched the old war leave deep scars on this land, scars that never fully healed. But this story was a different kind of pain. Adam explained that he had found fresh tracks in the mud near the wreckage. The tracks meant that whoever did this terrible thing had not gone far. That was the reason why he had avoided the main dirt road. He had cut through the dangerous back trails and dry creek beds instead. He had refused to rest, fearing that the children might fall into the wrong hands. He also mentioned that he had found an old Bible tucked beneath the broken wagon seat. The family name written inside the front cover was Calloway. Over the following days, Adam slept for long, exhausted stretches. His body was trying hard to recover from the brutal ride. Irma managed the twins almost entirely by herself. She quickly began to learn their rhythms, the same way she had once learned the rhythms of the weather and the soil. She did this by watching them closely and never looking away. One of the little girls always woke up irritable. Her tiny fists would clench tight before she even opened her eyes, ready to cry at the world. The other girl stayed calm, almost too quiet, until she suddenly erupted into furious tears. Irma began to tell them apart without needing names. She filed away these small details in her mind, the way a farmer learns the changing moods of the sky. She told herself that this arrangement was only temporary. Once their relatives were found, her life would return to its normal, quiet routine. But a small, lonely part of her heart already knew that was a lie. When Adam finally managed to stand up on his feet and make his way out to the front porch, the sun was warm. He found Irma sitting there. She was holding both babies at the same time, one tucked against each of her broad shoulders. She was murmuring something to them, her voice too soft for him to hear the words. For the first time, he really looked at her. She was nothing like the terrible stories he had grown up hearing about her kind. She was strong, yes, but there was a deep gentleness in the way she held those children. No rumor in the towns had ever mentioned that gentleness. "Thank you," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "Thank you for saving them. For saving me." Irma looked up, her expression calm. She answered dryly, "If you want to thank me, start by fixing that broken fence you were limping past." It was the closest thing to a smile Adam had managed to show since the massacre. He let out a small breath. Irma then asked him what he planned to do next. He told her he needed to ride into town to speak with the sheriff. He needed to report the attack on the caravan and start a search for any family the girls might have left in the world. "Until then," Irma said, adjusting the blanket around the quiet baby, "I will keep them alive." On the third day of his recovery, Sheriff Nathan Hale arrived at the farm. He was an older human with a kind face and a heavy silver badge on his shirt. He sat in Irma's front room and listened to Adam's full account. He asked about the tracks, the broken wagon, and the hidden compartment. The sheriff understood quickly that this was no simple robbery by common thieves. Something much larger and dangerous was moving through the territory. It was an organized group. As for the two little girls, Nathan said that finding their extended family could take weeks or maybe even months. Until then, the temporary care of the children would fall to Irma. He looked between the tall orc woman and the two sleeping twins in the basket. Although he said nothing aloud, it was clear to everyone in the room that those two children were already beginning to change that lonely house and the woman who lived inside it. The nights soon became the hardest part of the work. The twins woke up at completely different hours. Irma found herself moving through the dark rooms more often than she slept, but she learned quickly what each individual girl needed to feel safe. One wanted constant closeness. She needed arms wrapped tightly around her small body to stop crying. The other girl only wanted absolute silence. She preferred to be held gently without a single word spoken in the dark. On the fifth night, Adam appeared in the kitchen without being asked. He looked tired, but he reached out and lifted one of the crying twins into his arms. He spoke in a very low, rambling voice. He told the baby long stories about wild horses, trail dust, and ranches that people had forgotten long ago. To Irma's quiet surprise, the baby settled down within minutes, her small head resting against his chest. It became a regular routine after that night. Without either of them making a formal decision, they simply began to share the heavy weight of these two small lives. Adam started helping around the farm more and more each day. He mended the broken fences. He patched the leaking holes in the roof. He fixed the old barn doors, repairing what years of loneliness and solitude had let fall into disrepair. Irma found his constant presence strange at first. It had been many years since she had shared her kitchen or her yard with anyone. One morning, while she was washing his heavy coat in the outdoor bucket, her fingers felt something hard tucked deep into the lining of the cloth. She reached inside and pulled out an envelope. It was wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to keep out the rain. Inside was a letter. It was written in a careful, elegant, but worn hand. It was addressed to whoever found her daughters. The mother's name was June Calloway. In the letter, she described the attack on their wagon in short, broken fragments. She left behind a few small clues about the men who were responsible, but it was the very ending of the letter that struck Irma the hardest. June had not asked for wealth or comfort or high status for her girls. She had asked for only one simple thing. She asked that whoever found them would be kind to them. The letter also gave their true names, Elena and May. When Adam read the letter later that evening, something inside him broke quietly. The massacre at the river crossing was no longer just a nameless tragedy. It had a mother's handwriting now. It had a mother's final, desperate wish attached to it. Sheriff Nathan returned the next day to study the letter. The small details in the text confirmed what he had already suspected. A dangerous gang was operating in the region. They were targeting the lonely caravans along the western routes. The main name that surfaced in his investigation was Cutter Vane. He was a man known for terrible violence and for vanishing into the hills before the law could ever catch up to him. Meanwhile, Elena and May grew fast. They grew the way children do when they are finally safe and have enough milk to drink. The house, which had been completely silent for years, filled with new and wonderful sounds. There was crying, but there was also high laughter. There was the constant clatter of glass bottles. There were tiny noises that made the old wooden walls feel alive again. Irma noticed a strange, uncomfortable feeling settling into her chest. She realized she was growing far too attached to these children. She knew exactly what each girl needed before they even cried for it. She recognized their small moods, their habits, and their different kinds of quiet. This no longer felt like a temporary job. This felt like home. And Adam, too, had become a part of that house in ways neither of them spoke about aloud. They began talking more in the quiet evenings by the fire. They talked about their past losses, about their guilt, and about the strange, aching business of starting over. Irma learned that Adam carried deep emotional wounds that were far worse than the ones on his skin. Then came a new complication. Sheriff Nathan brought word to the farm that a blood relative had finally been located. It was a woman from the girl's father's side of the family. Her name was Vivian Ashcroft. She was traveling all the way from the civilized cities in the east. She would arrive within 2 weeks to collect Elena and May. The news landed like a heavy stone dropped into still water. No one said much after the sheriff left, but the heavy weight of it settled over the entire house. That night, Irma admitted to herself what she could no longer deny. She was not just caring for those children. She loved them as if they were her own flesh and blood. And perhaps, without meaning to, she was beginning to open her old, guarded heart to Adam as well. 2 weeks later, a polished black carriage rolled up the dusty dirt road leading to Irma's farm. The wood of the carriage was shiny, and the horses looked expensive. Irma knew who was inside before the vehicle even stopped. The woman who stepped out wore fine, tailored clothes. She moved with a rigid, practiced elegance that belonged in a city. Her name was Vivian Ashcroft. Everything about her, her straight posture, her sharp voice, and the careful way she held her chin, announced that she belonged somewhere far away from this dusty stretch of land. Her eyes swept over the modest farm, the old barn, the wooden fences, and the plain, weathered house. Nothing she saw seemed to impress her. When her gaze finally landed on Irma, something in her expression shifted instantly. It was a coldness, unmistakable and immediate. "So," Vivian said, looking Irma up and down with judgmental eyes, "you are the one who has been caring for the girls." Irma felt the deep disdain buried in the woman's question, but she kept her face calm and answered evenly, "Yes." Adam stepped out from the house behind her. His jaw tightened the moment he saw the wealthy woman's arrogant posture. Vivian barely acknowledged his presence. "I would like to see my nieces," Vivian said flatly. Irma led her inside the house. Elena and May were sleeping quietly in the large wooden crib that Adam had built with his own hands. For a short moment, as Vivian watched them sleep, something in her hard face softened. Her eyes glistened with a hint of tears. But the moment passed quickly. She cleared her throat and her cold expression returned. "They need to come with me," she said, her voice firm. "They do not belong here." Irma's stomach dropped painfully. Adam crossed his arms over his chest. "You just arrived. Perhaps you should spend some time with them before you decide anything." Vivian's gaze sharpened as she looked at him. "There is nothing to decide. I am their actual family. I know what is best." That night, the air inside the small house grew incredibly heavy. Vivian criticized everything. She spoke poorly of the small farm, the modest rooms, and even the way Irma held the babies during their feeding. But the worst part came during dinner. She set down her fork with a sharp clink and spoke without any hesitation. "With all due respect," Vivian said, looking around the room, "two human girls need to be raised in a proper environment." An immediate, heavy silence fell over the table. "In civilization," Vivian continued, her voice rising slightly, "with a proper education, with the right kinds of influences around them." Her eyes moved directly to Irma's green face. The meaning behind her words was unmistakable. She truly believed that an orc was entirely incapable of raising these human children. Adam stood up from his chair. His voice came out low and ice-cold. "Careful what you say next, lady." Vivian met his angry gaze. For the first time, she hesitated, but only for a brief second. "I am only speaking the truth," she said, holding her head high. "They deserve more than this place." Adam's palm struck the wooden table with a loud bang. "This place? You mean the home of the woman who saved these children's lives?" Vivian said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Adam stepped closer to her. "While you were sitting in your fancy mansion out east, Irma spent sleepless nights feeding them. She spent her days cleaning them and protecting them. Elena and May are alive right now because of her, not because of you." "She is still an orc," Vivian said quietly, her voice cold. The silence that followed those words was brutal. Irma felt something deep inside her heart crack. It was not from surprise. It was because a part of her had always known she would hear those words eventually. No matter how hard she worked, Some humans would only ever see her as a monster. Adam turned back to Vivian, his eyes filled with absolute rage. "Leave the table. Now." Vivian's shock was plain to see. Adam had not raised his voice, yet his strong presence filled the entire room. She rose from her seat without another word and disappeared up the stairs to the guest room. Irma stood frozen by the hearth. Adam moved quickly to her side. "Do not listen to a single word she said, Irma." Irma took a slow, shaky breath. "You do not understand, Adam. There are still so many people out there just like her." Her eyes grew wet with tears. "Humans who will smile at me until they suddenly remember what I am." Adam stepped even closer, reaching out to touch her arm. "I remember exactly what you are." She lifted her tear-filled eyes to meet his. "You are the strongest, kindest, and most courageous woman I have ever known," Adam said, his voice thick with emotion. The tears finally slid down her green face. For the first time in many long years, Irma let herself cry in front of another person. She let herself be vulnerable, and she let herself be truly seen. The next morning came with formal paperwork. Sheriff Nathan arrived at the farm carrying official legal documents. Vivian had wasted no time. She had already filed a formal request for full custody of the children. Legally, her position as a wealthy blood relative was very strong. But Nathan also knew the quiet truth that lived inside that farmhouse. He knew the girls were safe, thriving, and deeply loved where they were. Vivian spent the entire day watching Irma. At first, she watched her silently from the corner of the room. But as the hours passed, her gaze turned into something closer to deep attention. She began to notice the small things she had dismissed the night before. She saw how Irma always knew, moments before it even happened, when Elena would grow restless in her sleep. She saw how May would only settle down when Irma spoke to her in a specific, low, steady voice. The two little girls reached out for Irma instinctively. They turned toward her the way small plants turn toward the sunlight without ever being taught to do so. That evening, Elena began to cry very hard. She was completely inconsolable. Her little face turned bright red. Vivian stepped forward and tried to lift her from the crib. She rocked the baby back and forth the way she imagined a proper city caretaker should do it. But nothing worked. The baby's crying only grew louder and more frantic. Irma stepped in quietly. She did not say a word. She simply took Elena into her large, strong arms and held her close against her chest. Within seconds, the baby's cries stopped. She calmed down completely, her small hand resting against Irma's shirt. Vivian watched this happen in total silence. "How do you do that?" she finally asked. Her voice was much smaller and softer than it had been before. "She likes listening to my heartbeat," Irma said simply. "It lets her know she is safe." Vivian said nothing more for the rest of that night, but it was clear that something deep inside her had shifted. By the next morning, she had made her final decision. She gathered everyone in the front room of the house and turned to face Sheriff Nathan. "I am withdrawing my formal request for custody," Vivian stated clearly. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Nobody moved. She turned around to face Irma. Her eyes had completely changed. There was no arrogance left in them and no sense of cultural superiority. "I have spent my whole life believing that I always knew what was best for everyone," she said softly. "I was wrong." She looked over toward Elena and May, who were sleeping peacefully in their wooden basket nearby. "These two girls have already found their true home." Irma had no words to speak. Fresh tears rose in her eyes before she could do anything to stop them. "If I take them away from this farm," Vivian continued, "I would be taking away the only mother they have already chosen for themselves." Irma's calm composure broke completely, and she covered her face with her hands. Vivian then turned toward Adam, A small, unfamiliar smile formed on her lips. "And I suppose they have already found a good father here, too." Adam let out a quiet, surprised laugh, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. Over the following few days, the legal paperwork was quickly finalized by the sheriff. Irma received official, permanent guardianship of Elena and May. Vivian stayed at the farm for one more week. This time, there was no harsh judgment from her. She watched Irma move around the house with something that looked close to deep admiration. Before she climbed back into her black carriage to leave, she approached the orc woman one final time. "I owe you a real apology," Vivian said, looking her in the eyes, "for what I said to you, and for what I thought about your kind." Irma simply gave a slow nod. "Take care of yourself on the road," she replied. Irma allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "You already know that I will." Vivian returned the smile, and this time it was softer than before. "I know. That is the exact reason why I can leave them here in peace." As the fine carriage disappeared down the long dirt road, Irma stood for a moment longer in the middle of the yard. She watched the dust settle back down over the tracks. Then she turned around and walked back inside her home, greeted by the sweet sound of two small voices calling out for her. Weeks passed by, and the small farm settled into a beautiful rhythm that none of them had dared to hope for. Elena and May grew steadily every day. Their happy laughter filled the wooden rooms that had once known nothing but silence and sorrow. Adam's hands, which had been so raw and bloody from that desperate night ride, had now healed into thick calluses from honest, hard farm work. He spent his days mending the old fences, repairing the heavy barn roof, and building small wooden toys. Elena liked to chew on the toys more than she played with them, which always made them smile. But peace, as Irma had learned a long time ago during the war, rarely lasted without a price. Sheriff Nathan returned to the farm one warm afternoon. His expression was much graver than usual as he climbed down from his horse. He walked over to where Irma and Adam were working. "My investigation into Cutter's men has turned up some bad news," Nathan admitted, wiping sweat from his face. "Riders who match the gang's description have been spotted along the northern ridge. That is much closer to your land than anyone likes." Adam's jaw tightened instantly. "Do you think they are looking for the children?" "They might know the girls survived that caravan attack," Nathan said seriously. "If Cutter's men learn there were witnesses left alive, even if they are just infants, they will not leave it alone. They do not like leaving loose ends." Irma felt an old, familiar fear rise deep in her chest. It was the kind of cold fear she hadn't carried since the days of the war. But this time, it was not fear for her own life. It was fear for two small girls who trusted the sound of her heartbeat to calm their nightmares. Adam looked at Irma, his eyes fierce. "Then we will be ready for them when they come." That night, after the twins were finally asleep in their crib, Irma sat out on the dark porch. She had her late husband's old rifle lying across her knees. She was cleaning the metal with slow, practiced hands. The click of the metal parts was loud in the night air. Adam joined her after a while, sitting down on the wooden step. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke. "You have done this before," he said quietly, looking at the gun. "Prepared for a serious fight." "During the war," Irma answered, her voice flat. "I lost many people because we prepared too late. I do not intend to make that same mistake ever again." Adam studied her face in the moonlight. He saw the complete steadiness in her large hands and the quiet resolve behind her dark eyes. "You have carried so much weight all by yourself, Irma." "I am used to it," she said simply. "You do not have to be used to it anymore." His voice was low but very certain. "You do not have to carry the danger alone. Not anymore." None of it. Irma looked at him for a long, quiet moment. There was something deep and unspoken passing between them in the dark. She did not give him a verbal answer, but she did not look away from his eyes either. Over the following days, Sheriff Nathan organized a small watch along the dusty ridge roads. He warned all the nearby farms to stay alert for strangers. Adam worked late into the evenings by the yellow light of a lantern, reinforcing the wooden fences and the heavy barn doors. Irma kept the girls close to her side at all times. She even taught herself to listen for the distant sound of hoofbeats while she was fast asleep. Late one night, a low, sharp whistle sounded from the dark tree line at the edge of the property. It was Nathan's secret signal. Riders had been spotted about 2 miles out. They were moving slow and deliberate along the back trail that led straight toward Irma's farm. Irma's heart pounded hard against her ribs as she gathered Elena and May into her arms. They were still small enough to crawl only a few unsteady feet across the floor. She carried them quickly to the kitchen and opened the heavy wooden door to the reinforced root cellar beneath the floorboards. It was the exact same kind of hidden, dark space, she realized with a sudden chill, that June Calloway had once used to save her daughters from the attackers. "Stay quiet," she whispered softly to the sleeping infants as she laid them down on a bed of blankets. "Stay safe." Above her head she heard Adam's low, steady voice. He was speaking to Nathan outside by the barn. Irma climbed up and shut the cellar door, holding her breath. She stood by the window with her rifle. Then there was a long silence. After a few tense minutes, she heard the distant sound of horses turning away, retreating back into the dark hills. It was not over. Everyone in that house understood that the danger was still out there. But for tonight, the threat had passed them by. When Irma finally opened the cellar door, Adam was waiting for her at the top of the wooden stairs. His face was lined with deep exhaustion, but also with immense relief. "They are gone," he said softly. "For now." Irma nodded her head. She held both girls tight against her chest, feeling their small, steady heartbeats. Whatever Cutter Vane wanted, and whatever violence still moved out in the dark hills, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. She would never let it touch this family. Not while she still had breath left in her body. In the days that followed that terrifying night, the farm grew tense with quiet vigilance. Everyone stayed alert, though life continued to move forward in its small, stubborn way. Elena took her very first unsteady steps across the wooden kitchen floor, laughing as she fell into a pile of blankets. May discovered that she could make Adam laugh out loud simply by grabbing his thick beard with both of her little fists. Even in the middle of fear, it seemed, the household could still find moments of pure joy. But Irma noticed a clear change in Adam. Some nights, she would wake up in the dark and find him standing silently at the window. He would just stand there for hours, staring out at the dark ridge where the riders had first appeared. One evening, after the girls were safely asleep, she found him sitting completely alone by the dying fire in the hearth. He was turning June Calloway's old, worn letter over and over in his rough hands. "You have read that letter a dozen times now," Irma said softly, walking over and sitting down on the bench beside him. "I just keep thinking about her," Adam admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "Thinking about her lying over that hidden compartment in the wagon floor. She knew she would not survive the attack, but she made absolutely sure that her babies would." He paused, his breath shaking. "I found her too late to save her life, but I keep thinking about what she must have felt in those final minutes. She chose them over herself without a single second of hesitation." Irma placed her large green hand gently over his trembling ones. "You did not fail her, Adam. You carried out exactly what she asked for in this letter. Someone kind found her daughters. You brought them here." Adam looked up at her. There was something raw, broken, and unguarded in his eyes. "I just keep wondering if I actually deserve to be a part of this, a part of their lives." I am not their real father. I didn't give birth to them. I'm not even sure if I know how to be what two little girls need." "You already are what they need," Irma said firmly. "You have been exactly what they need since the very first night you carried them here through the storm, half dead yourself." Adam was quiet for a long, heavy moment. The wood popped in the fire. Then he spoke again, his voice even softer than before. "There is something else, Irma. Something I have never told you about my past." Irma waited patiently, not moving her hand from his. "Before the war ended, before I ever came out to this Western territory, I had a family." His voice started to tremble violently. "I had a wife. I had a little daughter." He swallowed hard. "A terrible winter fever took both of them in the exact same month. I have never forgiven myself for not being able to save them. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed." Irma felt a sharp tightness in her chest. She understood now. She understood the deep shadows she had often seen hiding behind his eyes when he looked at the twins. "That is the real reason why I could not leave those babies behind on that trail," Adam continued, looking down at his lap. "I told myself that if I could not save my own family, I could at least save someone else's." Irma reached out and took his hand fully now, holding it tightly between both of her strong hands. "You did not just save them, Adam. You gave them a real chance to be loved twice over, by you and by me." Adam met her eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them said another word. The fire crackled low between them. Somewhere down the dark hallway, one of the twins made a soft, happy murmur in her sleep. "I never expected to find this feeling ever again," Adam whispered, clearing his dry throat. "A real family. A real home." "Neither did I," Irma admitted softly. "I built very high walls around this old house long before you and the girls ever showed up at my fence. I did not think anything in this world could get through them again." "And now?" Adam asked, leaning in a little closer. Irma smiled faintly, a few hot tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Now, I think those walls were never actually meant to keep everyone out. I think they were just waiting for the right people to come and knock on the door." Adam leaned forward slowly, resting his forehead gently against hers. And for the first time since the terrible tragedy that had brought them together, the deep silence between them held nothing but pure peace. Outside, the night wind moved gently across the flat plains. It carried with it the silent promise that whatever still lingered out there in the dark, whether it was cut or vein, old grief or old fears, it could not touch the beautiful thing that had already been built inside these wooden walls. The trouble came the way trouble always did on the frontier. It came without any warning. It was late in the afternoon when Sheriff Nathan rode into the yard. He was riding hard, and his horse was lathered in white sweat. He jumped down from the saddle, breathless and pale. "Cutter's men were just spotted down at the river crossing," Nathan said, his voice urgent. "There are 6 of them, and they are moving straight this way." Adam was already moving before the sheriff finished speaking. He reached inside the door for his heavy rifle. "How long do we have?" "An hour," Nathan said, adjusting his gun belt. "Maybe even less than that." Irma's blood ran cold for a second, but her hands stayed perfectly steady. They always did when a dangerous moment demanded it. She had survived one brutal war already in her life. She would not let this peaceful farm become the battlefield that took her second family away from her. "To the cellar," she said to Adam, already turning toward the house. Elena and May were gathered up quickly from their play blanket. Irma carried them down into the reinforced root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, along with a few thick blankets and a small oil lantern. She held them close against her chest in the dim light. She whispered the exact same words she had whispered the very first night she found them. They were words of safety and words of promise. I will stay down here with them, she told Adam through the open trapdoor. Every part of her body wanted to stand up on the porch beside him with her own gun, but she knew the babies needed her protection more. Adam reached down and cupped her green face gently with his hand. I know. Just promise me you will come back up to me. All three of you. We will, she whispered. Above her head, she heard the heavy cellar door close. Nathan positioned himself near the dark corner of the log barn, his rifle raised and ready. Adam took his spot on the front porch, standing tall and watching the distant tree line with the same steady patience he had used to survive 4 days alone on the dangerous trail. The riders appeared on the horizon just as the setting sun painted the sky in deep shades of amber and dark violet. 6 men on horseback came out of the trees. They were moving slow and deliberate, exactly as Nathan had warned. At the very front of the group rode a broad, hard-faced man. He had a faint, ugly scar at the corner of his mouth. It was Cutter Vane himself. "Evening," Cutter called out across the yard. His voice sounded rough, like gravel rubbing together. "I heard a rumor that there might be some little witnesses hiding out on this farm. Word travels fast in these parts." "There is nothing here for you, Vane," Adam answered from the porch. His rifle was held perfectly steady in his hands, aimed right at the man's chest. "Turn your horses around." Cutter's cold eyes moved slowly over the farmhouse, calculating his chances. "Everybody has got something for me, friend. If I look hard enough, I usually find it." Nathan stepped forward from the shadow of the barn. His silver badge caught the last remaining light of the sun. "This land is under my official watch, Vane. You and your men would be wise to turn around right now." For a long, terrifying moment, nobody moved a muscle. The wind carried the dry scent of dust and distant rain across the yard. Somewhere below the house, deep in the dark cellar, Irma held her breath. She pressed one large hand protectively over each of the sleeping children. She could feel their small chests rise and fall against her palms. She prayed for their safety in the silence. Then, from the edge of the yard near the barn, one of Cutter's men shifted uneasily in his saddle. He glanced nervously at the sheriff's rifle. Then he looked at Adam's unwavering, dangerous stance on the porch. Finally, he looked past them toward the darkening ridge behind the house. Up on the hill, more of Nathan's deputized neighbors had quietly gathered in the shadows. Their rifles were glinting sharply in the fading evening light. The townspeople had come to protect the orc widow and the children. Cutter Vane's jaw tightened in anger. He had expected an easy target. He thought he was coming to a lonely widow's farm to find an exhausted traveler. He had not expected to find a community standing together. "This isn't finished," Cutter finally said, his voice low, cold, and bitter. "It is finished for tonight, Vane," Nathan replied evenly, not lowering his gun. For one final breath, everything hung suspended in the air. Violence was only a hair's width away. Then, Cutter sharply turned his horse around, spitting into the dirt yard. His 5 men followed him immediately. They retreated slowly back toward the dark tree line until the deep dusk swallowed them whole. A heavy silence held over the farm for a long time after the gang vanished into the hills. Only when Nathan finally lowered his rifle did Adam allow himself to take a deep breath. He rushed inside the house and ran to the kitchen, pulling open the heavy cellar door. Irma emerged from the darkness. Elena and May were still safely wrapped in her strong arms. Their small faces were perfectly peaceful. They were completely untouched by the great danger that had just passed right above their heads. Adam pulled all 3 of them into his arms at once. He held them tightly, the way a man holds onto something precious he thought he might lose forever. "They are gone," he whispered into Irma's hair, his body shaking with relief. "We are safe now." Irma finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came fast, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, beautiful relief of a mother who had successfully protected everything that mattered to her in the world. Above them, through the windows, the very first stars began to appear. They were scattered across a vast sky that was finally quiet enough to hold them. Cutter Vane's men never returned to the territory. Sheriff Nathan's official investigation was made much stronger by the details in June Calloway's letter and the statements of the neighboring farmers. The law eventually led to Cutter's arrest 3 counties to the east, ending a long chapter of fear that had shadowed the land for many years. But by the time that good news finally reached Irma's farm, several months had already passed by.
One slow, peaceful season folded quietly into the next. Life, in its patient way, returned to what it had slowly become. It was ordinary, and it was precious because of its ordinariness. Autumn settled gently over the wide plains. The leaves on the distant trees turned bright yellow and brown. Elena, who was now well past her very first year, had learned how to walk. She wobbled determinedly across the wooden porch, her small feet stamping loud, while Adam's steadying hands were never far behind her to catch her if she tripped. May had discovered her voice fully. She filled the house with delighted high shrieks whenever Irma sang low, wordless orc tunes while she was cooking supper in the kitchen. One beautiful evening, as the sky turned soft shades of orange, pink, and violet, Adam found Irma standing on the front porch. She was watching the 2 girls chase fireflies in the green yard below. He walked over and sat down beside her on the bench without saying a word. For a long while they simply watched the scene together. The girls were laughing, the farm horses were settling down for the night in the pasture, and the great land stretched out quiet and golden toward the horizon. Nathan finalized some more official paperwork in town today, Adam said eventually, breaking the quiet. Irma turned her head to look at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What paperwork are you talking about, Adam?" "Mine," he said. He took a slow, deep breath to steady his voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a document. "It is a joint adoption request for the 2 girls." Irma went completely still. Her heart gave a sudden leap. "But I only submitted it," he added gently, turning fully toward her. "If it is something that you actually wanted too." His eyes softened completely as he reached out for her hand. "Because I do not just want to be a father to them, Irma. I want to stay here with all of you for the rest of my life." Irma felt her heart swell so big it ached against her ribs. "Elena, May, and you," Adam said, his voice full of warmth. "You are my real home now, Irma." The tears slipped freely down her green cheeks, and this time she did not try to wipe them away. She let them fall without any hesitation or shame. "It took you long enough to realize that, Adam Carter," she said, laughing through her tears. Adam laughed softly too. He reached up with both of his rough hands and cupped her face gently. He leaned in and kissed her slowly under the evening sky. Everything that had been left unspoken between them for all those months finally found its perfect place. Inside the house, Elena suddenly began to cry out from her bed, and May answered her a brief moment later, their small voices rising together through the open window. Irma laughed softly against Adam's lips. "I think our daughters disagree with your timing." Adam rested his forehead against hers, a massive smile spreading across his face. "Our daughters," he repeated the words. "Our daughters," Irma echoed back to him. They rose from the bench together and walked inside the warm house. They gathered the twins up into their arms, settling them down by the warm fire until their cries dissolved into soft, contented murmurs. Later that night, once the 2 girls were finally fast asleep, Irma stood alone for a quiet moment in the doorway of their room. She watched the gentle, regular rise and fall of their small chests under the blankets. She thought about June Calloway. She thought of the letter written in a dying mother's hand, and of the single, simple request that had guided everything since that first terrible night. "Be kind to my daughters."
Irma pressed her large hand softly against her own chest, right over her heart. It was the exact same heartbeat that had calmed two frightened, shivering infants on the worst night of their lives. "I kept my promise, June," she whispered into the quiet room. "They are loved." Outside the house, the night wind moved gently across the endless plains, carrying the sweet scent of autumn grass and the promise of distant rain. Adam appeared silently behind her in the dark. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin lightly against her broad shoulder. Together, in the quiet night, they watched their daughters sleep. The children were safe, they were warm, and they were finally, completely home. The old house that had once known nothing but silence, loneliness, and grief now held laughter, bright firelight, and the steady, unshakable rhythm of a real family. They had found each other against every possible odd in the world, and they chose, every single day since, to stay together.